Welcome back, troop. You may remember our last video focused on starting fire using primitive means. And during that video, we talked about the value of using char cloth and how that made things a lot easier. Today, I want to show you how to make char cloth. So what do we need to make char cloth? First, we need a fire. Here we have a small fire that I've started. All right. It doesn't have to be a giant bonfire. Okay. We then need a little oven for the char cloth. This is metal. It's got a small hole punched in the top, but otherwise fits pretty tight. Okay. Doesn't have to be this big. If you have an Altoids thing, you can try that. An Altoids tin or some other small metal tin. And then we need cloth. And you can see here, this is some scrap cloth I had. Make sure your parents approve of whatever you're choosing. This is the leg of an old pair of Dockers, with the white cloth being the pocket on the inside of the Dockers. And that's what we'll use to make some char cloth today. All right, so let's start taking our cloth and getting it ready to become char cloth. Here you can see I've got this piece of cloth. It could be a rag, it could be an old t-shirt, but as I said at our last video, thicker cloth I personally find easier to work with once it's char cloth because it does get a little bit fragile. We're going to cut the cloth into like an inch or an inch and a half long strip. And then we're going to cut it further into little squares. It's a little bit big, we'll make it too small. Now you can see little squares of cloth there in the oven. But I also wanted to use some of this white cloth. The reason being, as you can see, these pants just happen to be black, and I want you to be able to see what happens to the char cloth when I put it in once it's done. So I'm cutting up some little white squares that we can use for char cloth. And there we go. We've got a nice little starter of pieces of cloth. Now we're going to take this and close it up. All right. So now you can see we've got our fire going along quite nicely. I've spread it out a little bit, made sure there's air for it to get in and under. Fortunately, the wind just changed. Now I'm going to take my little oven. I'm just going to stick it here in the fire. And what we'll be watching for, if you see that little hole that I'm pointing at right there, is as this gets started, you're going to see, as it heats up, smoke is going to start coming out of that hole. And so now, I don't know if you can see or hear, but there's now smoke coming out of the top, okay? As the cloth in there chars from the high heat, certain volatiles and smoke are going to be expelled out. All right, and we're going to be watching that carefully. Okay. So this took less than a minute to get started. I don't know if you can you see the smoke coming out of the hole?
Yes.
It kind of comes out, then it stops. Can you hear that sound? Listen. I don't know if you can hear a little sputtering, almost like a little choo-choo. And there you see it nicely coming out. And we're going to let this continue. Just make sure it's still sealed. Let it continue to smoke off. We're going to keep this on the fire until the smoke stops coming out of there. Again, we started this, and within 1 minute on a hot fire, it already started to do that. So I don't know if you guys can see this, but it's actually the smoke that's being driven off is actually burning as it leaves. So it almost looks like a little candle. That's the smoke being driven off as the cloth chars and heats up. And that smoke contains unburnt chemicals that once they get out here are actually catching fire and burning again, which is a neat effect. But it also demonstrates the fact that the stuff inside the oven is not actually burning. What's being driven off is still chemicals that have not fully oxidized, not fully burned, and are available to burn. And so we're going to keep going on this. Most of the smoke seems to have gone off, but we're going to keep watching for now. I don't know if you can tell here, but all the smoke seems to have been gone. Initially, mostly smoke poured out. By the end, when it slowed down, it was coming out slow enough that it could actually catch fire right at the mouth of the hole and burn. Shortly after that, it stopped. This whole process has been going on for about 7 minutes since I first placed the oven down on the fire. Pretty much it's done right now. So I'm going to take this. I'm going to use tongs, obviously. Should you grab it with your hand, that would be very unfortunate. Don't do that. Use tongs. You can make them out of wood if you have to. I'm going to take it out, right? And I'm going to now go set this aside to cool. And once it's cool, we'll open it up and see what we have. So it's been about a half an hour and it's cooled off nicely. You can see I can hold it. It's perfectly cool. So let's see what we've got. You can see there, nice pieces of char cloth. Now I feel like the very smallest white pieces kind of just came up into ash. You can see why I like the thicker stuff. It seems to have held up better. But I don't know if you can tell, even though it was started off black, it's now fragile and quite black, a little bit ashy. That's char cloth. And that's how we make it. Very useful for starting fires using primitive means. So if you're doing flint and steel or using a magnifying glass, this will greatly speed up your fire making.